Andrew read from John chapter 20, I want to leap forward into the next chapter, John chapter 21, which is the next chapter in the story of Jesus' resurrection. And Mark, your story about the chrysalis and the butterfly is so wonderful because it does wonderfully explain the resurrection life. That once we've experienced Christ in our life, it is a new life, and we do sprout wings. And if you ask the worm, oh, you're going to fly, if you say to the worm, you're going to fly, I hardly believe it. But when you sprout these wings, so to speak, metaphorically, or come to know Christ, it is like a new way of living. It's a total transformation. And in John 21, we see how the disciples begin to learn how to live that life post-resurrection, after the resurrection. Or in the church, we call this the resurrection life. How do we live a resurrected life after we've met Christ and He's transformed our lives? How do we live in light of the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Because He is alive, and many of us here have experienced His power in our lives, and we have to learn how to live in this new way, this resurrection life. And so in this next chapter, in John chapter 21, and I'm going to read through it just section by section, we meet the disciples as they go out fishing. As far as time goes, it is after the resurrection and it's before Pentecost. So it's probably a couple of weeks after Jesus' arrest, His trial, His crucifixion, and His resurrection. And we know that Jesus had been resurrected at this time because He'd already appeared to the disciples when they were meeting together behind locked doors. And He had appeared to Mary, we just read about that in John chapter 20, and He'd already appeared to disciples and reassured them that He was indeed alive. He even ate with them, and He reassured especially doubting Thomas, Thomas the disciple. He assured them that He indeed was alive. And yet here we are, we're with the disciples, it's a couple of weeks after the resurrection, and they're wondering what to do next. What are they going to do next? And it's intriguing that after such a momentous occasion as the trial, the crucifixion and the death and resurrection of Jesus, that they didn't know what to do next. But you know what, I don't blame them. After the 3 years that they'd had and the magnificent things they'd seen Jesus do, and then for Him to rise from the dead and then for them to witness His death and then to see Him alive again, I mean, my head would be spinning, wouldn't yours, after that? And I can totally understand why they're asking, what do we do now? You know, what do we do next? They hadn't yet learned how to live the post-resurrection life, how to live in the power of the resurrection of Jesus. Perhaps the full implications of the resurrection hadn't yet sunk in for them. But here's the thing, we can get stuck in that too, can't we? We can get stuck in that even today ourselves. We can become discouraged. We can ask ourselves, what am I supposed to do now? What am I supposed to do next? We can be wondering, what on earth is God up to? Or wondering where He wants you to go, what He wants you to do. And we can find ourselves in life sometimes that we're a little bit at sea, not knowing what the next step might be. Sometimes we can be in a place where we need to rediscover life all over again. We need to discover the resurrection life. Again, that's not a phrase we hear very often, only in the church, this phrase of resurrection life. So what do I mean by that? I mean it's life lived in light of the resurrection. It's a post-resurrection life. It's like leaving the old life behind, the dead life behind, and starting life all over again, starting life afresh. The resurrection life is all about living for God's purposes and not my own. That's what we mean by the resurrection life. It's a brand new life. It's a purpose-filled life. We know why we're here. It's a hope-filled life. It's a joy-filled life. It's an empowered life. And here in John 21, Jesus begins to teach the disciples how to live this new post-resurrection life. He begins to teach them about a whole new way of living. And just as the disciples of Jesus today, I mean, those who are following Jesus are disciples of Jesus today, we can learn that whole new way of living too. Because these stories that we read in the Bible, they're not just stories, are they? We're supposed to read them and we're supposed to learn from them and we're supposed to put what we've learned into action in our lives. And in John 21, we begin to learn how to live the resurrection life. And so first of all, let's have a look at John 21, 1-7. First of all, Jesus says we are to cast our nets on the other side. Let's read through the story section by section. It says there, afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. And the next slide. Wow, I can't read that. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple who Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it's the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and he jumped into the water. Friends, Jesus calls us to cast our net onto the other side of the boat. This is how we start to live the resurrection life. It's a metaphor, casting our net on the other side of the boat. See, much of the world is fishing in the same part of the sea. Much of the world is fishing in the sea of consumerism, the sea of materialism, the sea of selfishness, the sea of atheism, the sea of humanism. But to live the resurrection life means that we're going to have to lift our nets up out of that part of the sea and then let them down again somewhere completely different. We're going to swim against the tide, to use another sea, ocean sort of metaphor. We're going to do what Jesus tells us to do. And it's intriguing to ask why the disciples went back to fishing. They'd started out life, some of them had started out life as fishermen, but since meeting Jesus 3 years earlier, their lives had been turned upside down. They'd been at the centre of this brand new movement under Jesus' teaching and his leadership, and they'd seen such amazing things happen in his ministry and through Jesus' life. Thousands of lives had been touched and changed. And then they came to this monumental occasion, the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, their rabbi, their teacher, their leader. And just a few short weeks later, here they are trying to figure out what to do next. What does all this mean in their lives? And the best thing they could come up with was to go fishing. Now, I know some of you might think, well, that's not a bad idea. I love fishing. The best thing they could come up with was to go fishing. The point is, they went back to what was familiar to them, didn't they? They went back to their past. They went back to the Sea of Galilee, a place that they were familiar with. They went backwards. And here's the thing, they went backwards to the things that were familiar to them, and it didn't work. It says in verse 3, they went out, they got into the boat that night, they caught nothing. I wonder if you've ever felt like that. You're confused about what's next in your life, so you go back to what you know best, and it's not working. And you feel like, I can't even be good at what I know best. That's not even working for me right now. Well, if that's you, you're probably in the same place as the disciples were at that moment. We miss the fact that Jesus is asking us to fish on the other side of the boat, to lift our nets out of that old way of living and to lower them down where he says where to put them. We're still fishing around over here, but Jesus has moved. He's fishing over here. He wants us to move over here and start fishing elsewhere. Friends, if you want to live in the power of the resurrection, if you want to live in a post-resurrection life, you have to realise that Jesus has moved. He's fishing somewhere else. He's fishing where all the action is, where all the fish are, where all the life is. And if we want that, then we have to do what he says. He said to the disciples, lift your nets up, put them on the other side of the boat. And they were obedient to him. And when they were obedient, there was abundance for them. To live in the power and the fruitfulness of the resurrection, we have to do exactly what Jesus tells us to do. We're not going to find the power and fruitfulness of the resurrection life in the past by going over familiar ground. It's going to be found in the future. It's going to be found in what Jesus is doing today. It's going to be found in doing what Jesus tells us to do. And so, friends, God's purpose for your life is not found in your past. It's not found in doing what you've always done. The resurrection life is found in what Jesus is doing today, right now, right in this moment even. What he's doing now and what he will do in the future. Something has to change. And to get out of that rut, we have to do what Jesus tells us to do. That's how we live in the power of the resurrection life. And so at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I would like to live a different kind of future. I've got things going on in my life that need to change. I've tried all the old tricks and it's not working. I'd like to live in that new life, but I'm scared. A bit like Katie in that story we heard earlier when she was asked to go to Alpha. She was scared. She didn't know what to expect next. You might be thinking, I want to get out of this rut. I want to live in the power of the resurrection. I want to change in my life. I want to see change. I want to see new life come into my life. But I'm afraid of what that might mean for me. I'm afraid what Jesus is going to ask me to do. And if that's you, I want to ease your mind a little bit this morning about that, because here's what Jesus is going to ask you to do. He's going to ask you to love him and love people. That doesn't sound too bad, does it? That's what he's going to ask you to do. Love him and love people, and that's it. To love him and to love people. And this is the very next thing that Jesus teaches the disciples about living the resurrection life. If we want to live the resurrection life, we have to love Jesus and love people. The most important two things you can do with your life. To step forward into the future and to live in the power of the resurrection, Jesus is going to ask you to love him and to love people. I don't think that sounds too unpleasant, does it? Let's have a look at the interaction between Jesus and Peter in John 21. So going on again in the story, we read there, John 21, verses 15 to 17. When they had finished eating, because they'd gone to the beach and they'd cooked up some of these fish to eat with Jesus, they had breakfast with him on the beach. It says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. So Jesus is saying to Peter, if you love me, you will care for my people. If you love me, you will love people. This is what Jesus wanted Peter and the disciples to do, to love him and to love people. And friends, when you step forward into the resurrection life, that's what Jesus is asking you and me to do, to love him and to love people. It's that simple. You want to discover the power of Jesus' resurrection life for yourself today? Then feed his sheep, love his people, and love him. No matter what you're going through, no matter how downtrodden you might feel in life, there's someone that God has given to you to love. And that's your purpose in life, to love that person, to love those people, and to love the Lord as well. Our purpose in life is to love God and to love others. There's no greater purpose in life, Jesus said. No greater purpose than loving God and loving others. The greatest thing we can do with our life is to love God and to love others. But if we're honest, sometimes it's hard to love people, isn't it? Not everyone is as nice and kind and lovable and cuddly as you are. It can be difficult to love some people. And I've no doubt that God is calling you to love some people that are very difficult to love. And that's precisely why we need the power of the resurrection life in our life. We need the power of Jesus in our life in order that we can love those people who are difficult to love. Because we can't do it without being filled with the love of Jesus Christ first. So we have to first work on loving him and receiving his love and forgiveness for us. And then we can love others. We have to get our relationship right with Jesus first. Then we're able to love those who are difficult to love. You want to start loving someone who's difficult to love? Then start by loving Jesus first. That's where the power comes from. If you want to be more kind and gracious and loving towards others, then the place to start is to get a grip on how kind and gracious and loving Jesus has been toward you. And what else can we see when we look at the cross and what he went through? We see his kindness, we see his grace, we see his forgiveness, and we see his love for us poured out on the cross. That's how we begin to love others. If we want to be more loving, then we must take to heart Christ's forgiveness and his love. And we see this played out in the story here as we read about Jesus' conversation with Peter on the shore. Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And by the 3rd time, Peter was really hurt. And we know why he was hurt, because at Jesus' trial, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. "I don't know the man." And on the 3rd time, the rooster crowed, and Peter felt the guilt and the shame of rejecting Jesus in his hour of need. And now here is Jesus on the shore with this very same Peter who'd rejected him and denied him. And Jesus is lovingly restoring him. Lovingly restoring him. He's telling Peter, "My love for you, Peter, is much greater than your sin. My forgiveness for you is greater than your sin of desertion. There is no sin that the Lord cannot forgive." If Peter was going to move on and to lead and to love people and to live in the power of the resurrection, then he had to come to grips with the depth of Christ's love for him and Christ's forgiveness of him. And once you've experienced the depths of God's love and forgiveness, it's easier to love unlovely people. And conversely, when we're finding it difficult to love others, it's probably because we've taken our eye off what Jesus has done for us. Friends, if we're going to live in the power of the resurrection, then our appreciation for Jesus' love and his forgiveness of ourselves must move from our head to our heart. We must truly appreciate that. That's how we must live the resurrection life. We do what Jesus says, and we learn to love God and love others. Thirdly, we must learn to live an undistracted life and to follow Jesus. This is how we live the resurrection life. Let's take a look at the next chapter in the story. John chapter 21, verses 17 to 19. Jesus said there, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger," he's speaking to Peter here, by the way, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." 2 very important words, follow me. It's not a very encouraging view of old age there for Peter, but that's what Jesus said was ahead for him. When he was old, he wouldn't even be able to dress himself, and he wouldn't be able to choose where he wanted to go and when. And you can hear Peter asking, "Why me? Why do I have to go through that?" And we can be distracted from following Jesus by those kinds of questions. Why me? Why is this happening to me? Why do I have to go through this? How could God let this happen? Those kinds of questions are important questions, but they are questions that distract us from following Jesus. They're similar questions. They all have the potential to distract us from following Jesus and to rob us of the power of the resurrection life. Jesus is saying to Peter, you're going to have to face old age. There'll be some things that you don't like about it. There'll be some difficulties in life, and you don't need to be old to have difficulties in life. We all have difficulties in life. Jesus says to Peter, you're even going to have to face death, and that's true for all of us. That one day we're all going to have to face death. Knowing the difficulties that we all have to face in life, it's easy to understand why people would ask, why me? Why do I have to go through this? But the problem with the why me question is that it very quickly turns into poor me. Poor me. Self-pity. And self-pity is the thief of joy. And it's the thief of the resurrection life, the resurrection power. Because when we're pitying ourselves, we're not looking to God. We're not looking to his plans and his purposes. We're distracted from following Jesus. And we saw there that Jesus said to Peter, he ended up, at the end of that story, he said, follow me. Don't be distracted by the why me and the self-pity. Follow me. Let's read on in verses 20 and 22. It says there, Peter then turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who'd leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? And Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must, and here it is again, follow me. Do you get the point here that Jesus is telling Peter, don't be distracted, follow me. Don't be distracted by self-pity. Jesus doesn't want Peter to be distracted by the why me questions, the self-pity questions. And he doesn't want Peter to be distracted by the what about them questions either. And we're all guilty of that. Sometimes when it comes to following Jesus, we look at ourselves and we say, okay, I get it. I'm going to have to go through some difficult times in life. But what about them? What about those people? How come they don't have to go through what I'm going through? They're not going through the family difficulties that I'm going through. They're not going through the health difficulties that I'm having to face. They're not going through the financial difficulties that I have to face. What about them? It's an understandable question. But Jesus' answer is, none of your business. Basically, that's what he's saying to Peter. What's that to you? It's none of your business. And he's not being rude. He's basically saying to Peter, what I'm doing in John's life is between me and John. What I'm doing in your life is between you and me. And it's true for us too, isn't it? Let's not get distracted about what God is doing in someone else's life. We need to follow Jesus. That's our job. Follow Jesus. That's what he's telling us to do. And the problem here is a loss of focus. The why me and the what about them questions, they rob us of the resurrection life because they distract us from following Jesus. So friends, if you want to live in the power of the resurrection life, the life post-resurrection, we start by casting our net on the other side. We have to stop living in the past and recognise what Jesus wants us to do right now, to pull up our nets from the worldly way of thinking and to put them down where Jesus tells us to fish. You see it in the story. That's where the life of plenty is. By not fishing where everyone else is fishing, by fishing where Jesus tells us to fish. And it's a metaphor to say, not doing what the world is doing, but doing what Jesus tells us to do. Perhaps Jesus is asking you to do that today, to look to him, to do what he's telling you to do today. To live the resurrection life, we have to feed his sheep, or so to speak, to love the Lord and to love his people. To receive the love of God and then to give that out by loving other people. Perhaps the Lord's calling you to do that today, to receive his love and forgiveness so that you can love the others in your life. And thirdly, to follow him. we must follow him. If we want to live the resurrection life, not to get caught up and distracted by the why me or the what about them questions, but to focus on following Jesus. Is he calling you to do that today? To focus on following him? Maybe for the first time today. He's calling you to step out, to put your nets down where he tells you to put them down, to receive his love and forgiveness, and then to follow him. If that's you today, I want to pray a prayer, and you might want to pray along with me quietly in your heart, where you can do that, where you can receive, you can tell Jesus, I want to do what you tell me to do now. I want to leave behind, I know going back to the past doesn't work. I want to move into the life where I do what you tell me to do. And I want to receive your love and forgiveness. And I want to follow you. If you want to do that, then pray something like this. Would you all bow with me as we pray together? Lord Jesus, I'm sorry for the things that I've done that are wrong. And I ask you to forgive me. Thank you for your love expressed to me on the cross. I receive your love. And I receive your forgiveness. Lord, would you come into my life and empower me to follow you, not to get caught up and distracted in self-pity or questions about what's going on in other people's lives, but to focus on following you. Thank you. In Jesus' name. Amen.